Well, today, as we are starting again on the Red Letter Road, I do want to remind everybody that we've been looking here at what Jesus has to say. And if you're new with us, we've been on this series, this what we call year-long teaching series called the Red Letter Road, where we're looking at what Jesus has to say about really important things about life and faith and about God and about who we are. And like I always want to say to everybody, if you want to understand the Christian faith, you've got to at least know what Jesus says. That's a really good starting place. That's a really good foundational place to be. And so this month, we're going to look at what Jesus has to say about money. And today, our first message in this January chapter is called What's in Your Wallet? It's called What's in Your Wallet? Now, I just want to say, as we begin today's, what Jesus has to say to us about money, I know that sometimes when we start talking about money, people sort of fall in maybe two sort of categories. Maybe even there's more. But there's a group of us, I think, who feel like, I manage my money pretty good. I take care of my financial resources. I already have my RRSPs all figured out. I understand what my retirement plan is. I know when my mortgage is going to be paid off. I have strategic budgeting strategies, spending plan strategies. And yet at the same time, there's a tendency that group of people also have a sort of a sense of, well, they have a sort of a sense, maybe, and I don't want to accuse anyone of this, but maybe a well-deserved sense of pride, looking at other people who don't manage as well. And they also feel like, look, there's really, Dave, nothing you can tell me about managing money because I know how to manage my affairs. So thank you very much, Pastor, and we'll go from there. The other group of people, which actually there's a lot of statistics out there tell us that, and obviously we're part of the Canadian public, there's a lot of people out in the Canadian public right now who are really struggling with money. Money is a stressor for them. Money stresses their marriage. Money stresses their personal life. Money is not an easy conversation to have. Money for them, they feel like a failure. So when they start even come to church and they go, oh my goodness, you're going to talk about money. Well, money is the one dark place in my life that I'm really struggling right now. If you could only see my credit cards, I'm maxed out. And I'd like to look at those commercials called Easy Financial, which actually I have other words for those places. But the point is, it's a stressor. And what I want to say here today is this, is that I want you to hear this right up front. That as a church, and as we talk about being followers of Christ, we talk about what it means to put our faith in Christ. Jesus doesn't really care about your money. He cares about you. He cares about your heart. He cares about knowing that how intertwined our sense of worth and identity can get hooked into money. And he also knows that the world tells us that money makes the world go round, and yet he knows that actually it's God who holds the whole world in his hands. And what Jesus wants us to always deal with when he talks about money, and this will be one of those themes you'll hear over the next few weeks, is that Jesus wants to see where our heart actually is and to focus more on the kingdom of God and to then allow our money just to be an expression of that focus on him. So today we're going to come again to some of Jesus' words. And here are the words today, and it's found in Matthew 6. Now, actually, if you start a little earlier up in Matthew 6, Jesus is talking again about, and Kevin already referred to this, Pastor Kevin, in our offering time, was that, where do you store your treasures? Do you store your treasures on earth, or do you store your treasures in heaven? And he's talking again about the whole idea about money. And so what Brent Hudson and I, our teaching pastor, decided we do is we just focus in on this one key verse because we think it illustrates a fundamental issue that we have to wrestle with when we're dealing with money. So here's what Jesus says. No one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money. As we wrestle with these words of Jesus, he's setting up for us a bit of a dichotomy here. He's setting up for us this idea that we have to make a choice about where our focus will be. The first thing we want to say if you're following along in our teaching outline is that he makes this very clear that the first priority for a person of faith in God is simply this: we are called to serve God. Actually, when you think about this, Jesus is actually taking us back to the Ten Commandments. Because in the Ten Commandments, in the first two of those commands, we're told this: you must not have any other God but me, and you must not make yourself an idol of any kind. Those are the first two commandments. So you cannot have any God before me, and you must not make an idol of any kind. See, for Jesus, his priority was serving God. Because he loved his Father, because he wanted to be in his Father's will, he knew that love meant serving and seeking to do his Father's will. If you read the stories of Jesus, we realize that at one point, Jesus, early at the very beginning of his ministry, was taken into the desert and tempted by Satan himself. And in the third, he actually was tempted 3 times in that encounter in the desert. And the third temptation was really about wealth and money and riches, because we're told that Satan took him up to the a peak of a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in their glory. And Satan said to him, I will give it all to you, he said, if you kneel down and worship me. And then you can see here what Jesus' response was. He says, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God, and there's that priority again, and serve him only. Actually, Brent, who's far better in Hebrew than I am, reminded me that actually when you look at the root of the Hebrew words of worship and serve, they actually are very similar. They come from the same base root. That as we worship God, we're serving God. And when we're serving God, we're actually worshiping God. And so Jesus is reminding us here that we have to ask ourselves, what is life's priority? And he's reminding us in this very simple contrast with money. He says, either you're going to serve God or you're going to serve wealth or mammon or money. And he's obviously telling us that we're called to serve him. I mean, how does that work out for us? Well, if serving God is Jesus' first priority, it's also the same true for us. And actually, this is how the Apostle Paul describes the priority of serving God. He says, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. See, our true north has to be this. When we get up each week and frame our week, what is the ultimate North Star for us as we live our lives? How do we make our choices? You know, I would pray that maybe your prayer every week would be something like this. God, in light of your love and grace, whatever I say and do, may it bring you honor. May I seek your way in my life. May all I have and all I am bring you pleasure and show my love for you. God, this week, not my will, but your will be done. Now, let's be honest. Will we do that perfectly? No. No matter how imperfectly, though, I live this out, God looks on our hearts and seeks to see if that's our desire. You see, the question is this. You got to serve somebody. Actually, Bob Dylan wrote a song like that, since we're quoting songs here. Remember that old poetic song of Bob Dylan? I know, you may say, I don't know who Bob Dylan is. Well, look him up. You got Google, but not now, okay? You may be an ambassador to England or France. You may like to gamble. You may like to dance. You may be a heavyweight champion of the world. You may be a socialite with a long string of pearls. But you're going to have to serve somebody. Yes, you're going to have to serve somebody. Well, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. So the question is, again, is that here Jesus reminds us that no one can serve two masters, but you're going to have to love one and despise the other. You're going to be devoted to one or you're going to hate the other. But you're going to have to serve somebody. And so Jesus reminds us that our first priority in life is all about this call to serve God. And please understand, we're called to serve God in our work, in our play, in our choices, in the midst of the circumstances that come to us expectantly and unexpectedly. And we're also called to serve God with our money. They're all sacred activities under the rule of a sovereign God. So that just sort of sets the template. That's just a baseline for us. Am I serving God? That's part of my direction in life. But that brings us to the other thing, though, as we consider Jesus' words here about who you're serving. He illustrates for us that there's a battle going on. There is a battle here, and it's about the power of money. You know, when Jesus reminds us that we have to make a choice here between serving God and actually in the original statement here, Jesus used an Aramaic word, because Jesus spoke in Aramaic, and he used the word mammon, which actually can be translated wealth, or it can be translated money. But what he did was, by using that word mammon, he was personifying it. He was giving it a personal quality, as though we have to make a choice. Will I serve God, or will I kneel down before mammon and wealth? Will I give my life to that? You know, as we think about this, we have to understand Jesus is reminding us, and this is a fundamental point, that wealth, money, has power. Now, let's be honest. You go, oh, money, wealth doesn't have power. I can be very intellectual about it. What is it when all of a sudden someone comes in and drops a lot of money in front of you? You can feel it. There's something almost hot coming off it, right? I mean, what is it when we go to a museum and we see something extremely, wealthy, like the jewel crowns or something like that, or we see some rare diamond on a documentary, and we can feel the wealth and the power, right, that's all rooted in that. I mean, even when we watch the ads for, buying lottery tickets, what are they attracting you with? They're saying, here is where pleasure and security and status come play, right? So, please understand, if you are tuning out right now because you're still recovering from getting up early, please hold on to this thought. Jesus is warning us that money has power in our lives. It has power. Now, what does it have power to do? Well, let's look at three things really quickly. One, it has power to capture our hearts. Paul writes, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and have pierced themselves with many griefs. Now, please understand, money itself is not evil. It's the love of money. The Bible is very clear about this, because all of us need money in the way we manage ourselves as a community, right? We need something to help us make transactions so that we can buy groceries and have shelter and purchase food and meet all the other needs of our family and ourselves. But what we need to ask, whether we have a lot of money or barely enough, is simply this. Does money grab your central affections? Has it become, in the Lord of the Rings statement, my precious? Are we unable to resist its siren song of status, sway, and security? Has money got your heart focus? Is it, if you're honest, it's battling for your first love? Does money even take you to that place where you think, you know what? I can love God and money. I can mix them together. And thus we think we can mix together faith in God and materialism because money has rooted itself so deeply in our hearts. Remember, and Kevin already read this, wherever our treasure is, that is where our heart is as well. You know, when we have this love for money, it can produce a lot of grief. Actually, I checked this out on the website last night. I was reading about this, and I didn't really believe it was true, but there is this millionaire man down in California who apparently, over the last number of years, took an ornate box, filled it up with gold and jewels worth over $2 million, and put it somewhere, 5,000 feet, somewhere up on the Rocky Mountains between California and the Canadian border. And he has written a map, or actually not a map, he's written a poem that you can try to decipher it and find your way to the treasure. And actually, I think it's called, let me see, it's Fen. It's Fenn. Yeah, Forrest Fenn. So you just go up Fenn's poem, type that in to Google, and you actually can read the poem, okay? Now here's the thing. Last summer, 53-year-old Jeff Murphy was hiking in Yellowstone National Park when he disappeared. Park investigators found his body on June 9th where Murphy had fallen 500 feet from what was called Turkey Pen Peak after slipping down a chute. You know, as we think about that story, Murphy was following the poem, and he was looking for this treasure. Murphy is the fourth man now to die searching for that chest. Okay? Now we can go, oh, but here's the reality. What Jesus wants us to think about and address is when money captures our heart, it ultimately removes our sense to depend upon God, and we become a servant then to it. Money convinces us that that's really what we need. And in the process, we go over the cliff to our own destruction. You know, the other thing money has the power to do is not only capture our hearts, but also has the ability to rob us of contentment. What's it say here in Hebrews 13:5? Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. Now here's a fascinating illustration of how money doesn't make us content. In 2018, so this is all recent stuff, Harvard Business School undertook a first-of-its-kind study of over 4,000 millionaires in the United States. Okay, just to let you know, there's more than 4,000 millionaires, all right? And asking them how much money it would take to make them happy. And you're thinking, you got more than $1 million, why wouldn't you be happy? But you got to listen to these answers. Each millionaire was asked to report how much they currently had and how happy they were on a scale of 1 to 10. Then how much money they thought they would need to get to a 10 on their happiness scale. So all these millionaires, maybe they said 4, 6, 8, and then they were asked, so how much money do you need to get to 10 on the scale of 1 to 10? Shockingly, 26% of the 4,000 millionaires, so that's about 1,000 of them, said they needed 10 times more money in order to get to 10. 24% said, well, I just need 5 times more of my millions that I presently have. And then followed by 23% said, well, if I just doubled it, I'd get to 10. Only 13% of the 4,000, so about 400 of them, said they currently had enough to be happy. Now, here's the most surprising part of all in this study. This answer was consistent no matter how much money the person had to begin with. So there were people who had $100 million who were saying, I still need 10 times more or 5 times more. And there was people saying that with 10 million. Now here's the point. I think when Jesus says you have to make a choice between serving God, or serving money, one of the litmus tests to tell you that you're moving towards serving God is you can say, you know what? Enough is enough. At some point, you need to start saying, when will I stop saying, I need this to be happy. I need more of that to be happy. I have to have more money in order to be happy. At some point, we have to be able to say, you know what? I trust God. He's not going to leave me. He's not going to forsake me. And now I don't always need to be striving for that little bit more. Here's the other thing that money, as Jesus talks to us about who you're going to serve, is that money has the power to also help us lose sight of the big picture. What does Jesus say actually just earlier on here in this Sermon on the Mount? He says, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. I think we can get so caught up with our money and we forget how fleeting it really is. Several years ago, construction workers were laying a new foundation for a building outside the city of Pompeii. Everybody remember what Pompeii was all about? Well, they found a corpse of a woman who had been fleeing from the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, but was caught up, obviously, in the rain of hot ashes that poured down on her. But what they found with this woman's perfectly, covered remains was that the woman's hands clutched these incredibly precious jewels, which were preserved in excellent condition. She had the jewels, but death had stolen it all. And that, we know, is the bottom line to life. Worldly treasure is not a wise investment because we all know the saying, you can't take it with you. See, money makes us lose sight of the big picture because money has the power to blind us spiritually. I think of a pastor who one time was teaching on the 7 deadly sins, and he advertised it in advance each month, what's deadly sin. Sloth and greed and lust. And his wife said to him, "Oh, have you published those in advance?" And he said, "Yeah, I have." She said, "I guarantee you the lowest attended study you're going to have will be the one on greed." And sure enough, she was right. Because everybody else, they can kind of see it right in front of them when they're lazy. They know when they're lazy. Or when they're lusting, they know when they're lusting. Or when they're being angry, they know when they're being angry. You can't hide it. But greed has a way of being like they say about heart attacks, right? High blood pressure is that silent heart attack killer. You don't see it. And so often, we can look at everybody else and think that maybe they have problems with greed, but we don't see the greed in our own life. It blinds us. Actually, to be honest with you, I've had people come to me over all the decades of me pastoring, and they confess some sins to me. I've played that role of a priest-like person for them, where they said, "Pastor, I've really blown it here." Can I tell you, honestly, I've never had anybody come to me and say, "Dave, I am a greedy person." Not one time in my entire life I've heard anyone say that. Because you see, that's not a problem for us, right? Money has the power to blind our hearts to what God is calling us to believe and to become and to do. And we lose sight of the big picture because we really no longer can see it because money blinds us. Where money now has become our master rather than our servant. Here Jesus is reminding us that we need to store up for ourselves treasures in heaven. Can we remind ourselves that the ultimate treasure of heaven is trusting in what Jesus did for you? Jesus himself is the one treasure who died to purchase you. He was Lord. He had ultimate status. He had ultimate security. He was the Son of the Father. But when he came to earth, what happened to him on the cross? He was utterly stripped. He lost all his treasure. Why? Because he died for something. Now, you only die for what is precious to you, to go back to that Lord of the Rings idea. And this means Jesus Christ must have looked at all of us and said, if I have them, even going to hell will be worth it. I think about so often when we talk about money, there's this whole idea that, money gives us security. I think of a story I came across where it says a couple young women who became Christians at a college. They went back to their parents and said, "We became Christians and we want to be missionaries." And each of their parents said, "Now, dear, you have had a religious experience and that's wonderful, but you need some security first. So before you go off to your missionary experience, which is fine, we want you to have a master's degree and we want you to take a job or two so you've gotten your career off the ground. And then we want you to have some money in the bank for some security before you go out into the world to be a missionary." So the women went back to their college and talked to one of the professors they respected. And the professor said, "Well, what do we say about that?" And this professor said, "Here's what I would say to your parents. Tell them we're on a little ball of rock spinning through space and it's called Earth. And who knows if we're going to run into something. But even if we don't, someday under each one of us is going to open a trap door. And everybody's going to fall off. And at the end of your life, a trap door will open up underneath you and you will fall off this little ball of rock. And underneath will be either the everlasting arms of Jesus or nothing at all. And you think a master's degree is going to give you security?" Jesus' words remind us, where's your treasure? Is it going to be here on earth or is it going to be in heaven? Will we live as, the challenge for all of us is, will we live out the economy of the cross? Sometimes I know people get really uptight when we say, what are the standards of generosity in a church? And people say, the Bible does give us the biblical teaching of 10%. That's a kind of a good guide. People start freaking out, 10%. And yet, imagine if Jesus said, you know what, I'm just going to tithe my blood on the cross. He didn't. He gave us all. We're called to live and mindful of what Jesus did for us. That's the big picture. You know, when we get sight of the big picture, you know what that means? It means that young people, when you go and fulfill a career and use the gifts God's given you to meet the needs of the world around you, you won't simply say, I'm going to take the job on my Indeed app that says, this is how much we pay, and we pay better than everybody else. You don't simply take a job because of the amount of money. You have a bigger picture now. You want to take a job that serves others, that meets needs, that helps people. And if you happen to be blessed economically with that, then that's a blessing as well. You know, I also want to say to all our business people and other people involved out in our economy of our world, when you see the big picture and are storing your treasures in heaven, you're not going to just simply say, well, this is business, Dave. If we have to destroy the environment, if we have to ruin people's lives, if we have to undercut people, if we have to hurt workers, if we have to hurt tradespeople because we're always going to weasel down to the nickel and dime them to death so that they're out of business, well, Dave, that's just business. You know what's happened? You've lost sight of the big picture. You see, we can't take it with us. It's true. But Scripture teaches us that God will look at how we will use our resources that we're blessed with. Paul says we'll all one day stand before Christ to be judged what we did good in our bodies and what we did bad. And yes, we stand there under His grace. But we'll be asked, like, what did you do with the resources we were blessed with? So what do our hearts really treasure? Does the use of our money show that we are focused on the things that matter to Jesus? You know, that brings us just to the final part here, when God's our boss. You see, really, Jesus is saying here, you can't serve two masters. Which is it going to be? Is God going to be your boss, or is money going to be your boss? And here, let's just think about this just for a moment. You see, we know that there are songs out there in the world that says money makes the world go around. But like I said earlier, it's God who makes the world go around. Jesus says God's kingdom is coming. And so when we finally say with our resources, God, your will be done, we're moving in the direction of letting God be the boss of our money. You know, when God's the boss of our money in our wallet or in our money app, something begins to happen. Here's two things. Let me end on this. One, money loses its grip on us. And how do we know money is losing its grip on us? Three quick things. One, money loses its grip when we start to love rich people. That's right. Because all of a sudden you know where your wealth really is. And so rather than looking at rich people and getting angry at them or disdaining them or going, I bet you they don't pay all their taxes or whatever, you will love them because you know where your wealth comes from ultimately. Guess what? You'll also love poor people. Rather than looking down at a poor person saying, well, obviously they're lazy and they don't work and they're not using their abilities and all that, you will love them and you will respect them. And you won't judge them. Because again, you know that you're a sinner saved by grace and you know your ultimate wealth was given to you. You didn't earn it. And here's one other thing that you know when money's losing its grip on you, and you know God is your boss, is you'll practice generosity. And this is actually here. Paul wrote this to the church in Corinth, and he gave them instructions. And, you know, some people say, why is it that I come to church every week and people take up an offering? Well, we're actually doing what the Bible teaches us. Look at what it says here. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, saving it up, so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. Every week, you make a decision. God, what is it that I can give? Because you see, generosity starts to become part of your signature because you understand how much God has given you. You know, Richard Foster said this: when we let go of money, we're letting go part of ourselves and part of our security. But this is precisely why it's so important. It's one way of Jesus' command to deny ourselves. You know, like I said, we encourage people to think about saying, move towards that 10%, but ultimately start to give consistently, proportionately. Why? Because it starts to generate that understanding that money is not my God, not my master, but my servant to do good with for God's work in God's world. Here's the last thing. When God's the boss, not only will money lose its grip, but money will become an instrument for good. You know, I love the story of the Good Samaritan about this guy. He was traveling and he got beaten up by criminals and thieves and he was left for dead. And of course, there were religious dudes that walked by him and didn't do anything for him. And then this Good Samaritan, a foreigner, shows up and was probably a traveling salesman and takes him to a hotel, bandages, clothes him and whatnot. But notice what it says here in the story that Jesus was telling. I love this part of the story. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. And looking after him, he said, and when I return, I'll reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Just to give you context, 2 denarii doesn't mean anything to us, right? But here's the thing. Brent reminded me, he said, that's basically 2 days' wages. Now, you think about what you make in a day's wage and then multiply that by 2 and just say, hey, here, I got some money. That's probably, for some of you, that's probably a couple $100 at least, right? Boom. Here it is. See, money was being used for good. See, when God's the boss of our money, we can make a difference in other people's lives. We can help our local church family be a light of God's love and truth in this world and in our neighborhoods. We can reach the next generations and become a church that grows younger, not just older. We can support works of justice here and around the world. We can show acts of mercy to people in need. And we can also use our money to invest in the common good for others. One final illustration. I'll end on this. You know, the reason the early church was so successful, there was an old letter from Diogenes who told why the early Christians stunned people. And this Christian leader, Diogenes, wrote this. He says, we share our table with all, but we do not share our bed with all. He said, in other words, pagans are promiscuous with their bodies, but stingy with their money. And Christians, he said in turn, are stingy with their bodies and promiscuous with their money. See, can you imagine a city here of Greater Moncton and beyond, in Riverview and Dieppe and beyond, that was filled with those kind of people? That's going to be a healthy community. A neighborhood filled with those kind of people are going to be a healthy neighborhood. There is a tremendous public ramifications of following Jesus' words. Who are we going to serve? Are we going to serve mammon, money, wealth, or are we going to serve God? We got to make a choice. And when God's the boss and not money, we're going to find ourselves living in a life that serves God. And instead of loving money and using people, we're now going to love people and use money as an instrument for good. So let me ask you this. What's in your wallet? What's in your wallet? I'm going to ask Pastor Kevin to come up. And as the service is coming to a close, this is a time for prayer. Kevin, as you lead people in prayer in this time, there are pastoral needs I want you to make sure you cover and all that. But please make sure you have a moment where we just pause and ask ourselves, where's our heart when it comes to money? God bless you. God bless you all.